She took a job cooking for cowboys on a farm, not knowing one of them owned the land they stood on. Clara Hensley stepped down at first light and knew the ranch kept more than cattle. On the porch, a missing plank bore 3 shortcuts and 1 long, as if someone tallied debts nobody dared speak. In the kitchen, a stove scarred by years waited beside hammered pans and a coffee pot whistling a nervous tune. She set flour, salt and lard, then paused. A cutting board showed a brand burned faintly into the grain, the same shape carved into the porch gap. In a dented tin lay a horseshoe nail wrapped in paper that said only Low Field. Boots thudded. Men slid past the doorway, voices low. A pantry door hung on a bright hinge, locked from the outside. Behind a recipe card she found a penciled map from bunkhouse to creek, then down toward a swale labeled Low. The word rubbed nearly away. Cowboys filed in with wet hats and guarded eyes. One carried a bell without a clapper. Another wore a boot stitched with a scar that matched the tally on the porch. A quiet hand appeared beside her, steadying a sloshing kettle. Elias Ward, worn boots, calm shoulders, a coin rolling once across his knuckles, flashing a crest that matched the board's ghosted brand. He said nothing, yet everything around him seemed to arrange itself. Amos, a lean trader, stood in the doorway, rein on his collar, eyes on the coin. "Funny thing," he murmured, "how a mark follows its maker." Under the counter lay a ledger with names crossed twice, and a backward entry meant for a mirror. Taped beneath the drawer, a brass key and a rule pinned behind the door. "Don't ask about the Low Field after dark." Carefully she lifted the key, heart thudding. What happened next will shock you. Clara woke before the grey rim of dawn and moved through chill air that smelled of ash and sage, fingers coaxing tinder at the firebox, until the stove drew breath. She measured coffee by feel, set the kettle to hiss, sifted flour, pinched salt, cut lard into pale pebbles, and dripped water until dough turned supple beneath her hands. Biscuits rose near the door where heat spilled. Beef browned with onions, in a dented pot, steam curling as she deglazed with a splash of last night's brew. Outside, hooves thudded and a latch clanged. Voices traveled the porch with the low music of men who learned patience on long rides. She kept her face calm and her hands busy, because food delivered on time could say what she wasn't ready to say. The first cowhand ducked in, hat tipped, eyes quick, then others filled the room and took plates with thanks short as rope. They studied the stranger, feeding them with the wary courtesy working crews reserve for anyone new. Elias arrived with a flour sack on his shoulder, wore boots gone soft at the heel, and spoke in a steady undertone that landed without ripple. He set the sack by the bin, tied the string, asked if she wanted it shelved, then fixed a loose hinge with a driver he carried as if he always expected some small break to appear. No claim, only help. She registered it the way she registered heat as part of the work. They ate with focus sharpened by miles, breaking the rhythm only to mention a calf gone thin, a fence that begged new wire, a creek crossing that had bullied horses the week before. A harmonica tried a tune and gave up to laughter. Clara ladled stew, split biscuits and kept coffee moving, learning names by tasks. Hank, who roped clean, Mays, whose rawhide held, Dodd with knots, Pike with jokes, and feeling the first faint easing of the distance between kitchen and porch. In the town she had fled, hunger had turned every errand into a spectacle, and whispers into knives. Here, effort could build a shield one meal at a time. She wiped the blade, stacked pans, salted a skillet for scouring, and stepped to the doorway long enough to watch the corral. Horses tossed dark heads, a brindled dog threaded between heels, ropes sang against posts, clouds layered the horizon like hammered lead, and wind sniffed at the eaves with the promise of a squall. She stocked tinder, counted matches and set extra biscuits in a tin in case riders dragged in soaked and shaking. At noon, mud clung to boots and shirts, carrying the cold metal scent of rain that had not fallen yet. Men ate leaning on elbows, talking through mouthfuls about posts, trapped in clay and a chute gate that stuck when pushed, and they thanked her in practical ways afterward. Mays straightened a draw track, Pike left an apple, Dodd drove a hook for her apron where a weak nail had drooped. Elias hoisted a water barrel onto a higher stand, so gravity could give her hands a rest at the spigot. He met her eyes only to ask whether the flow suited her height. It did. The afternoon settled heavily. She noted flour and beans in a ledger, turned wicks, trimmed splinters off a spoon handle, and reminded herself that belonging was a practice, not a pride. From the yard came the short curses of a novice rider, and the patient correction of a veteran who had already seen 3 springs more dangerous than this one. Someone told a story about hail that once rattled a wagon roof, so loudly a pair of mules bolted for a stand of aspens, and wedged the tongue between trunks like a thrown spear. Work scattered, then converged again near sundown, as if drawn by the lantern glow turning the kitchen into a small boat on a darkening sea. She browned more beef, scraped the pan, diced potatoes, opened the last jar of tomatoes, and tasted for salt until the stew settled into itself. Then the storm arrived all at once. Wind slapped the window and shouldered the door. The dog barked, then ducked beneath a bench. Riders came in wet to the spine, hats dripping, shirts darkened to another color. She kept bowls moving, biscuits traveling from pan to hand to mouth, and coaxed flame from wood that hissed. Through the fogged panes, she glimpsed a sky that had turned the color of iron, and in that reflection she saw an older fear, the swift verdict of people who decided what you were worth before you even spoke. She lifted the heavy pot without shaking, steadied it with a towel, and refused to carry that verdict further. By the time thunder rolled north, bellies were full and voices low. In the quiet that followed, small kindnesses surfaced as if a lowered wind let them be seen. Mays asked whether the shelf should sit higher for her reach and moved it up 2 holes. Pike returned another apple, shrugged and said it was spare. Dodd tapped a nail and told her a trick for keeping a wooden spoon from splitting. Elias dried the floor where tracks had smeared mud, then set the bucket aside. Only then did she notice the old net of callus etched across his palm, the kind that told the story of years spent lifting, tying, mending. Others glanced toward him without being summoned, a habit that suggested weight carried without display. She filed that away beside the water barrel, the hinge, the sack. The sky softened to a bruised violet. She closed the sash, banked coals so heat would survive until morning, and let the kettle breathe near sleep. Her shoulders ached as if stitched with rope, yet something steady settled under the ache. This place pressed hard, demanded proof, watched with a skeptic's eye, and still granted what she had needed most, a chance to stand without apology. The porch creaked under a last pair of boots. Tack clinked as someone hung a bridle with care. The dog gave one contented thump of tail. Wind tested the eaves again, then moved off toward the low fields. Clara slid the ledger into a drawer, set dry kindling for dawn, and promised herself that when the weather came, she would meet it ready. She had kept fires alive through leaner nights than this, and if her gaze sometimes met Elias's in the busy margin between one task and the next, she let the thought drift like a cloud that might break or slide on. Morning would come early, with dough to fold, beans to soak, and a table to set for men who judged by what a person did, not by what was rumored. In that measure she could live, and in that measure she would prove herself again, as many times as the basin. Before she slept, she wrote one line on a scrap tucked beneath the ledger: "Keep the fire steady, keep the food honest, keep your head up." Outside, distant thunder grumbled again, a reminder that storms travel, but so does grit, and tomorrow asks again. Rain started before daylight, a tight drumming that thickened until shingles chattered like a wagon on stones. Clara coaxed a flame from sullen coals and felt the draft change, smoke first sulking, then slipping up the flue. Coffee hissed. Biscuit dough took shape under quick fingers, beef met onions in a scarred pot. Wind slapped grit across the step. From the yard came snorts, chain clinks, a gate bang, then hurried boots. By breakfast, the sky had turned iron, rain flying sideways, riders knotting slickers while checking lines. She kept the stove breathing and watched figures smear across the glass as if the storm were rubbing out edges. Men arrived in waves, soaked to the collar, hats dripping, eyes narrowed by the math of scattered cattle. She spoke little ladled bowls, split biscuits, slid plates along the table, refilled cups, and pointed toward dry cloths hung near the fire. Steam drifted from denim and wool. A brindled dog shook off water, offended by a storm that ignored its bark. More boots, more mud, more noise. Between every arrival, Clara added beans to the stew, shaved onions finer, and saved crumbs to coax thickness from meager stock. She stretched flour with cornmeal and kept the kettle at a cautious tremble so she could swap pots without losing a boil. Outside, thunder rolled like wagons over a hidden road, and lightning stitched bright needles through low clouds. Hooves scrambled in the corral. A panel groaned. Someone shouted and vanished into the rain. Elias moved as if built for the churn. He cleared slick patches with a mop between orders that cut through noise without slicing pride. Pears to the south fence. Pike to the creek bend. Hank after fresh rope. Maize on the gentler gelding for skittish steers. His voice was a firm plank over rough water, and men glanced for the small nod that sent them out warmed by purpose. Clara salted sparingly, tasted and corrected. The roof rattled. Thunder rolled like distant wagons. Lightning stitched bright threads again, quick as breath. She dragged a bucket beneath a new leak and returned to the stove with a defiant calm. Tasks lined up like posts. Starch, salt, fat, boil, simmer, serve. Rags around handles, back braced, she hauled the big pot off the hottest ring. Weight pulled, wrists burned. Before the shake won, another hand steadied the far ear. Elias, silent as weather before a break, set his palm and kept liquid from slopping. Wet wool, horse, raw rain on skin. For a heartbeat, they anchored the iron together. She nodded once. He eased away without claim, grabbed rawhide, and sent Pike out grinning through the door. The moment sat in her like a coal she would later find still warm, though she turned back to work as if nothing had shifted. Rain bullied the yard until paths turned to pale pudding, and hoofprints drowned where they were made. Crews rotated through the kitchen, shivering, eating fast, and heading back to lines. Clara counted faces, balanced portions, and coaxed warmth from through. When meat grew thin, she mashed beans smooth, used coffee to deepen color, slipped the last jar of tomatoes into the broth, and let a crumble of yesterday stand in for richness. She jammed cloth into a window crack, retied hair that clung to her neck, and kept bowls moving. Words floated between bites, posts trapped in clay, a low crossing going slick, a gelding steady under noise. Elias returned with a boy whose ankle had twisted in muck, and quieted him with a sentence that carried years. Take breath. Temper folded like paper, and the boy ate as if heat could set a bone. The crew stood near the blaze, boots steaming, eyes already on the door they would cross again. Not because any man enjoyed misery, but because duty left little room for alternatives. Clara didn't ask for thanks. She listened for chores announced without complaint, and adjusted the next round so hands could leave faster. When refills slowed, she loaded biscuits into a deep bowl for speed. Outside, thunder paused. The yard almost dared them to hope. Then wind shouldered back with a harder slap. Another crash sent Elias out with 2 riders. Clara filled canteens, wrapped slices of bread in cloth, and stacked them for quick grabs. She looked around the kitchen and understood that every nail, hook, and hinge mattered when weather demanded proof. The hinge he had tightened yesterday held. The water barrel he had raised spared her back. Small mercies added up. Another pot waited for the pantry shelf above her reach. Elias brought it, heavier than it looked. She tried to lift and felt the old tremor spark. He caught the far handle without question. Fingers touched in the handoff, brief, steadying, more honest than talk. The spark unsettled her because it suggested safety in the middle of chaos. She dismissed the thought and filed the sensation beside other details. A water barrel he had raised yesterday, hinges he had tightened, lines he had spoken that made people move with less friction. Afternoon collapsed into a bruised dusk. Clouds dragged low bellies over the ridge. The yard churned to paste. Word came that a sweep on the south flank had gathered a runaway bunch and pushed them home. Elias arrived last, coat soaked dark to his ribs, hat dripping a steady thread. He asked if the old iron could take one more hard push. Clara said it would if fed right. He smiled with half a mouth, swapped her dry towels for chilled rags, and kept the space clear while she turned dough into dumplings and set them sinking through the bubbling surface. He checked the draft when smoke crawled and shifted a log that had trapped heat in the wrong corner. Then he was gone again, lantern in hand, guiding 2 riders toward the north paddock. Wind found new seams. Water crept under the door. The dog stopped protesting and chose instead to lean against Clara's boot between trees. She told herself strength didn't always sound loud. Sometimes it stood still and let other people move. If you reading this, remember a moment you kept going so someone else could stand, held a door in the weather, gave the warmer coat, carried a weight when another stumbled. Let that memory sit with you now. It lives in backs that lift and hands that ladle while storms try to turn kindness into tinder. The storm faltered, gathered, then faltered again as if deciding whether to start another quarrel. Fewer shouts reached the kitchen. Cattle bawled in scattered pockets, then settled as lines held. Clara fastened the ledger, cleaned the counter with small circles, and recognized that her hands shook less, not because labor had stopped, but because purpose had pressed fear aside. Elias stacked bowls, said the only praise that counted here, that carried us, and checked latches. He offered to shelf the last pot riding above her reach. She passed it up, fingers grazing metal where his steadied grip waited. The sensation was precise, work softened by another's presence. Why did people arrange themselves around him quietly, like spokes around a hub? Why did rooms seem to shape themselves to the things he refused to say? She set the questions down because conjecture could wait, and cleanup could not. She scrubbed pans, wrung cloth, left a tin of biscuits for riders who would surely return near midnight, and banked coals for dawn. Outside, rain thinned to a silver thread. The dog sighed. Clara eased onto a stool and let her muscles voice their complaints, while satisfaction took inventory. She had held her line, he had held his. She thought no further than that accord between 2 workers who held the line. Morning would bring repairs, stuck wheels and a ledger of mouths to feed. She tightened her apron string, heard the last drop slide from the eave, and never guessed the man who mopped could sign deeds. Naming the valley, curiosity hovered, then drifted, and rest took her hand. When the hard weather moved on, it left puddled tracks, bent grass, and a barn roof singing with loose tin that clacked whenever wind remembered its shove. Mud-rimmed posts, ropes hung heavy, and a split gate leaned against a hinge that had lost patience. Clara rose before pale day, coaxed warmth from sullen coals, breathed careful air into kindling, and fed chips until flame found confidence. The pantry stood thinned to bone, a jar of beans, coarse meal, 2 sprouting onions, a heel of salt pork, 3 eggs, the last tomato jar, a scoop of flour, and a stubborn scrap of cheese. She shaved rind into broth, softened the heel with milk, stretched meal with flour, and coaxed comfort from a stew that began as an apology and finished as steady encouragement. Men entered with quiet steps, shoulders sore, faces roughened by grit that washing could not fully chase. They lifted bowls the way cold hands reached toward fire, grateful yet braced for more labor. Someone left an apple, polished bright as a small promise. Another straightened a bent nail where towels hung. A third slid a good spoon from his coat, claiming he had 2 and believing no kitchen should rely on luck. Small kindnesses stacked like split wood. When the iron handle loosened, Pike filed a shim and stopped the wobble. When a shelf sagged, Mays planed a sliver, seated the board, and added a bracket without speech. Clara answered with refills, arriving exactly when needed. Her hands cooked and listened, adjusting to rhythms the way riders rid skittish horses. Onion skins became stock, bones lent strength. Leftover coffee, deepened gravy, biscuits warmed on a tin near the edge of the heat, and yesterday's crumbs formed a crust that made lean stew feel brave. Elias carried water without hurry, tipping barrels onto the stand he had raised, then set the dipper where her reach asked. He inspected Mais's fix, tightened a single screw, mended a lantern cord, cut fresh wicks, and hung the lamp from a nail he tapped true. Tension near that porch could flare fast. One wrong word about a horse, a line or a lost calf, might turn a room sharp. Elias never scolded, never boasted. He let silence cool minds, and used a sentence the way a steady hand quiets a skittish mouth. When Hank and Dodd squared off over a gate, left unlatched, he stepped between them and pointed toward the ridge, asking which path would hold tomorrow. The question stole heat from anger. By the time their eyes returned, fists had unfolded. Clara watched that ease and filed it beside other quiet facts. The small tools in his pocket, the habit of placing buckets where spillage wouldn't turn steps treacherous. The way he saw corners other men ignored. He seemed ordinary until rooms leaned. Afternoon, a boy from the lower pens brought a broken stove handle and looked embarrassed. Clara wrapped the screw in thread to thicken its bite, tapped the threads back, tightened the fit with a rag to save her palm, and handed it over. He exhaled like someone allowed to remain. That evening he returned with a small jar of honey his mother had traded for, set it down as payment, and left before protest formed. Every gift lived where she could see it when chores turned long. Apples thickened porridge, honey glazed a slab of salt pork, and made it seem like a festival. The spoon stirred stock with a rhythm that calmed breathing. She carried coffee to the men working nearest the gate, and poured it into cups held out without hesitation. Near sundown, two riders clashed about a misplaced rope. Elias said one plain line: "1 coil saves time, 2 prevent loss. Choose the future you want to meet at dawn." He picked no side. He pointed them toward work and away from pride. Clara's throat tightened because scenes like that had gone differently in the town she left, where power burned like a match tossed toward dry walls. Here someone watered sparks instead. After dishes, she scrubbed the floor with hot water and lye, wiped the sash and propped the door so air could clear the day's density. Elias used a plane to smooth the lip of the pantry shelf, where a crack had raised a thorn, sanded blue dust from the groove, wiped the board with oil, and asked if jars would slide more easily now. They did. She returned to sorting beans by hand, drawing away stones and delivering clean food into a basin. If you carry a memory of a person whose steady help arrived without speech, whose hands fixed small things, and by fixing them, kept your spirit from fraying, hold that name for a breath, and let gratitude pass through you. The world tilts more gently, because such people stand where strain collects. Night came tender, broomed clean by a northwest wind that smelled of wet earth and pine. Stars climbed, coyotes sang beyond the hayfield, and the lamp burned low, wick trimmed to a calm oval of light. Clara wrote a short list, so morning would meet plan rather than panic. Soak beans, knead dough, steep coffee, slice apples thin, set aside rations for riders bound to the north fence, mend an apron strap. Fatigue pressed across shoulders, though satisfaction lightened it. The men no longer treated meals like anonymous deliveries. They told stories while eating, honest ones with wrong turns, and small victories tucked between pragmatism and self-mockery. When old worries nudged, memories of sideways looks, withheld change, a clerk's smirk, she saw the handle, the honey, the apple bowl, the repaired shelf, the lantern with a new wick, and felt steady. She caught Elias watching from the doorway as she tied cloth around a loaf, and lifted it so steam wouldn't bleed into the crust. His gaze carried no demands, and offered no explanations. It weighed the room as if measuring whether the space could keep holding people together. Her curiosity reached toward him like a hand toward a rail in darkness. Did he sleep fully, or only in portions, waking when the wind changed direction? Did rooms everywhere find their level when he entered? She let those questions pass because rest needs quiet, and morning arrives early. These gestures did not erase the past, yet they wrote over it line by line. She banked coals, covered the dough bowl, folded the list beneath the ledger, and finally lay down. She allowed one harsh memory of hunger, then answered it with another image. A spoon, a shelf, a jar, a hinge, a dipper placed where her hand would find it without strain. The day began with scraps and worry, and ended with proof that care multiplies when offered plain. Sleep gathered, and with it a belief she barely dared to claim. She might belong here after all, not because anyone declared it, but because work and regard had intertwined around her like twine around a parcel, holding everything intact while the road still bucked for now. Wind returned like a grievance that never learned manners, shouldering across the valley until cottonwoods bowed and dust sheets lifted before dissolving under new rain. Clara rose while lamps still glowed weakly, coaxed embers with a splinter and breath, then fed kindling until the iron box exhaled heat again. Outside, ropes slapped posts, gates rattled, and hooves hammered muck that swallowed depth markers. The first gust bent smoke sideways, stinging eyes, yet the flame clung to life. She anchored pots, shifted damp wood, and braced lids with spoons to kill rattles. Water crept beneath the door, thin at first, then insistent, turning boards slick while thunder rolled across ridges like wagons tumbling through ruts. She chopped onions with quick economy, scraped fat into a skillet, browned scraps left from yesterday, and stretched broth with coffee and a coin of cheese shaved thin. Rain thickened until the yard vanished behind a moving wall, leaving only noises, shouted names, a dog's frantic protest, the metallic groan of a panel, giving. Elias stepped through the doorway, soaked to the hatband, asked for bread to pocket, pointed 2 riders toward the south line, and vanished again into slate murk. Clara held the kitchen together with stubborn attention, feeding fire that wanted to sulk, shifting kettles to friendlier heat, drying towels near the back of the stove, and laying biscuits where steam could leaven them fast. A hinge squealed. She oiled it and tied the bottle high so waves of feet wouldn't knock it over. The dog planted beside her ankles, eyes on the door as though hoping the weather would go away. Wind rose higher, heaving against walls, until lantern chains clicked like teeth. She steadied herself with work that tolerated no panic. Salt, stir, taste, correct, serve. Men arrived in bursts, faces slicked gray, sleeves filmed with grit, boots clogged to the shank. They ate without speeches, dipped bread, thanked with nods, and returned to the raw. Between surges, she wrung cloths, swept puddles toward a bucket, and propped a board across the threshold to nudge water aside. A crash drew a curse from the yard. A young hand slid in, limping, mouth white with pain. She wrapped a bandage tight, tucked a biscuit into his pocket, and sent him after Elias's lantern. Lightning forked so near that every pan flashed white. She kept stirring. Beyond the window, cattle bawled in scattered pockets that moved like islands breaking apart. Elias gathered teams by 4s, then 3s, then pairs, matching riders to ground like a surveyor drawing choices with a pencil that never hesitated. He hauled one cowboy from mud that gripped to the knee, swung him across a saddle, slapped the flank, and pushed the mount toward higher ground with a shove that trusted muscle, tack, and habit to carry the rest. Clara watched that single motion through rain-streaked glass, something in her ribs easing, as if proof had arrived that steadiness could outtalk fury. She ladled stew, stacked biscuits in a clean towel, and kept the stove breathing. When flame flagged, she crouched low, built a tipi of dry slivers, and offered breath until orange lifted, like a stubborn child deciding to rise. Her shoulders burned, wrists ached, and her lower back stabbed whenever she hoisted the big pot. Still, she held the line because hunger during storms turns tempers brittle and bodies less brave. Another slam, more boots, another round of bowls. Then the door flew wide and returned with Elias carrying a gray-faced rider over one shoulder. He set the man by the hearth, spoke evenly, counted beats, then nodded when color returned. Orders followed like stones set across a flood, so others could cross. Blankets, rope, dry gloves, 2 lanterns, 3 fresh cinches, and 1 longer line for the northern dip where ground steals riders by inches. He pressed a wet sleeve across his brow, took bread from Clara's hand without ceremony, swallowed, and moved. She felt the brush of knuckles when she passed the pot past steam. A jolt went through her blood, not romantic, simply human, one body catching weight from another because too much failed when carried alone. If you reading this, remember an hour when somebody's steadiness turned fear into something workable, let that companion's name sit on your tongue for a breath. Storms end, but memories of borrowed strength keep roofs standing. Afternoon never brightened. The sky stayed iron, so the day felt stuck between hours. Clara portioned carefully, scraping the last marrow from bones, thickening broth with crumbs, and slipping a spoon of honey into the kettle when bitterness crept forward. The dog barked twice, not hopeful, only alert. Beneath gales, the ranch sounded alive in a brutal way. Chains, wind, hooves, voices, fighting distance. She set aside a tin of biscuits for midnight and wrote a short ledger line with damp fingers, so supplies would not lie in the count later. Steam jeweled her hairline. Windows bead-tracked every gust. Elias appeared again, a moving silhouette soaked, dark as river stone, and asked after the boy who had limped. Back with maize, she answered. He nodded once, set two snapped reins on the table for later repair, and held the big pot's far handle while she poured into a waiting pan. Their hands met a heartbeat, breath tumbling with heat and wet wool. The steadiness in his grip felt heavier than iron, as though responsibility had Why does he carry so much, she wondered, and who asked him to? She shook the thought aside because flame demanded wood and mouths demanded food. A gust drove rain under the sill. She shoved rags into the crack, then shoved harder until the leak surrendered. Thunder marched north and returned south, indecisive as a quarrel that could not find its ending. Word came that a fence near the creek had failed. Teams pivoted without outrage, merely accepting the next necessary Elias paced the doorway, calculated lanes through flood and slope, and broke the crew into smaller groups that could weave cattle toward the high bench, without clogging the bottleneck where rock pinched the trail. He went last, carrying a coil over one shoulder and a second cinch in his fist. Clara watched the lantern swing into gray and felt her throat heat with worry she refused to name. She cleaned pans, set fresh coffee, then pushed a pan of cornbread close to the mouth of the stove, hoping the crust would form despite the humidity. Work numbed the ache, until a thud rattled crockery. A rider slumped across the threshold, laughing from relief rather than humor, then pointed outside with a thumb that trembled. Elias had pulled Pike from a hole where silt behaved like hands, yanked him free by belt and collar, and shoved him toward a rope crew before the mud changed its mind. Clara closed her eyes for a second, opened them, and poured a bowl. Boots thudded away. Minutes blurred. A calmer patch opened, then closed. She rotated logs, knocked ash into a pan, and propped the oven door with a spoon to chase moisture. The dog checked the sill, returned, and leaned on her cap. Supper arrived in a staggered line. Men drenched, silent, grateful, already looking back toward whatever waited. She delivered food, bearing heat to the threshold and handing it off so floors stayed clear. Elias returned with a hitch in his step, and a gash across one knuckle already clotted. He accepted a cloth, pressed, then asked for the status of coffee like a man refusing ceremony. Clara tilted the pot. He said good, and left his cup on the sill for a moment while explaining the next sweep. 2 to the east pasture, 3 across the draw, and 1 stubborn bull to haze away from the broken fence before dark truly failed. She heard leadership wrapped in refusal to lord it, the sort that made people straighten because somebody had chosen clarity over noise. Trust flared so quickly it startled her, like flame catching a hidden pocket of resin. She saw him through glass blurred by rain, unyielding under weight, shoulders squared against the gusts that tried to fold him. He looked ordinary until wind tested resolve, then the ranch seemed to hinge on his balance. The thought returned, heavier now, more than a hand, more than a foreman, maybe the bone beneath the ranch's skin. She carried on, because speculation filled no bowls. Night pressed down early, dulling edges. Storm bands faltered, regrouped, then tore across the yard again.
When the weather finally unclenched its grip, the valley exhaled like a patient waking after a fever, puddles gleaming in broken ruts, while the repaired fence line stood stubborn beneath a rinsed Wyoming sky. Clara coaxed the stove from sullen embers to a steady blaze and set the day in motion, with motions learned under pressure. Coffee by instinct, cornmeal folded into scant flour, onions shaved fine, a heel of salt pork rendered to give broth a backbone that tasted like courage. Men drifted in with sleeves frayed, knuckles raw, jokes soft from fatigue, and took their places around a table that had become the nerve center of hard work. She poured, ladled, split biscuits, and watched shoulders drop as warmth turned clamor into human talk. Outside, horses shook mud from fetlocks, a gate creaked where a hinge still sulked, and the dog dozed beside the threshold, as if keeping guard over the part of the house that stitched the outfit together. In that quieter light, the past week rearranged itself. The storm had been a test that revealed which surfaces were paint and which were grain. The kitchen had held. So had the people who met its demands. Her meals now felt less like favors and more like necessary infrastructure. Riders arrived with an apple left by a plate, a spoon found and surrendered, a new wick for the lamp, and a shelf bracket carved to fit the pantry's leaning wall. She answered those gifts with precise timings, refills that appeared before anyone needed to ask, and small adjustments that saved seconds for men who spent every hour under a ledger of weather and stock. Elias threaded through it all the way. Water finds the easiest path, while still wearing stone down. He carried a barrel when her back barked, trimmed a stubborn door lip smooth, moved a bucket so drips would not turn boards into traps, and cooled tempers with one sentence that left pride intact. She had grown used to the sound his quiet made, the hush that follows an argument diffused rather than won. On a bright noon washed clean by wind, visitors rode in from the south and west with hats tipped low and dust like pale smoke clinging to cuffs. They came to trade wire, count horses, haggle over yearlings, compare notes on hay, and of course to eat. Clara set long boards with bowls and mugs, turned stew until it shone, slid cornbread from the iron, brushed tops with honey a boy had bartered 2 days earlier, and poured coffee that carried a civilized hint of chicory someone had pressed into her hand with a shy nod. The room warmed fast. Talk braided around numbers and names, homestead gossip, winter omens, and the stubborn ways of fences that pretended to stand only when watched. She moved between shoulders, answering requests before anyone formed them, and felt a grounded ease settle in her chest. She belonged because her work had proven itself under weather and scrutiny alike. Then a rancher with a wind-burned face and a confident chuckle lifted his mug toward the crowd and said, almost lazily, "You folks ever meet the elusive owner of Windriver? Man's a ghost. Sits among hands, then vanishes when it suits him. Lucky sort, keeping his hat brim low." Laughter rolled across the table. Someone said, "I keep hearing that." And another, "He was right here yesterday, swear it." Spoons clinked, boots scraped, a plate slid, caught, and steady. Clara kept moving, yet the floor shifted under her as if a board had finally exposed the gap it always hid. She lifted her eyes. Elias sat 3 seats down, not at the head, not even in the comfortable center, only where an extra elbow would make room for a younger rider. He broke a biscuit, gave half to Pike without flourish, poured coffee for a lanky boy whose cup had gone dry, listened while a visitor bragged about a bull that ignored fences, and offered no opinion when the talk returned to the invisible head of this place. Calm radiated from him the way heat slips from iron, felt most clearly by those near enough to need it. Their gazes met. His was level, unreadable, neither warning nor confession, simply present. A small tide rose in Clara's body, not fear but something sharper and weightier, a gathering of meanings that had been scattered like nails after a wagon rattled across ruts. The coin she once saw roll across his knuckles during a quiet hour, the hinge he tightened without being asked, the water barrel raised to spare her back, the pot steadied during a downpour that tried to fold the house, the sentence that drew 2 men away from fists, the habit Cruz had of glancing toward him when the work needed shaping, the map he voiced out loud, not as a command but as clarity. All of it rearranged into a single statement, her blood accepted before her thoughts caught up. The owner was not absent, not distant, not even hidden. The owner had been moving through her kitchen every day, wearing work like a common coat, refusing to place himself above the line that bound the crew to the land. Elias, who avoided display, signed decisions with action, and left the signature where only the results could read it. Her hand trembled over the stew as she filled another bowl. A spill hovered, then settled. Breath came thin and quick, then steadied under the practiced rhythm of serving. Shock hollowed space around her, making noise feel farther away. Yet within that hollow a second feeling sparked, something like intrigue wrapped around a bruise. Why keep such a truth folded? What did he want to learn by standing at eye level while carrying a weight that could tip any room he entered? If he had named himself on day one, she might have bent around that power without noticing how it worked. This way she had seen the skeleton of the place, and she had watched him shoulder beams without calling attention to the lid. A visiting buyer asked for seconds. She obliged. Another praised the seasoning. She nodded without really hearing. Elias set a stack of used plates near the basin, as if he were any other hand cleaning after a meal he did not cook. The dog moved closer to her boots. Wind murmured at the east. The world did not alter its spin, because she had learned its axis. Yet inside she felt the pivot click. Memories resequenced themselves with a clarity that almost stung. Lightning splitting cloud while his palm steadied iron. Mud trying to swallow a man while he braced and hauled a lad face down in despair while one sentence reset his breath. A simmering quarrel cooled by a question that pointed toward tomorrow instead of yesterday. A shelf mended, a rope coiled, a latch tested after the house had quieted. None of it took grandeur. All of it took choosing the harder kindness at the exact second, when lesser men leaned on rank. Betrayal pricked, not because he owed her private knowledge, but because she had walked blind beside a truth, so large it touched everything she did. Still the sting softened, replaced by steadier curiosity. What oath binds a man to labor so completely that he refuses to be cushioned by his own authority? Who taught him that command is only clean when it stands indistinguishable from service? She moved back through the room with a pot that felt heavier than before, only because it carried new meaning. Fine food, a guest said, tapping his spoon as if blessing a clock. A place eats like this. It run. She thanked him, and set a heel of cornbread aside for the boy who had fixed the latch yesterday. Elias rose to refill water, avoiding the part of the floor that was still slick under drips, and placed a towel where others would step without thinking. Nothing changed. Everything changed. Chairs scraped, papers surfaced, figures drifted across wood, and a buyer asked when signatures could be set. Before sundown, Elias answered, as if offering to fetch nails. Heads bobbed, then talk slipped into brand marks and date. Clara kept her hands moving to stay in the stream of a day that insisted upon itself. The crew cleaned. The visitors left. The noise thinned, and light slanted across a room that looked suddenly brighter for having given up a secret she had already, in truth, almost known. He wiped a plate. She rinsed a pan. The stove painted his sleeve with a shine the color of patient metal. Neither spoke of titles. Neither pretended that nothing had shifted. Between them the silence had weight, but not the suffocating kind. It felt like a staging ground where words would arrive only if needed. Night folded around the ranch like a worn coat, finally hung on its peg, and the kitchen kept one low circle of light, the stove breathing a patient red behind its iron door, while the last traces of coffee and soap lingered in the air. Clara dried the final plate, set it carefully where the shelf ran smoothly under Elias's plane, and stood with both hands on the counter to steady the tremor that had found her wrists, ever since noon's careless remark turned the day on its hinge. Boots had stopped moving outside, horses had quieted, even the dog slept with its nose tucked beneath a paw. Yet her thoughts kept walking the rooms of memory, opening drawers she had not known were there. The water barrel raised to save her back. The bucket was placed where spills would not betray a step. The hinge tightened before it squealed. The heavy pot steadied in the rain, the rough word that never came when tempers tilted. The way work flowed toward him without fanfare. Whenever the ground grew mean, she heard the porch board that always answered wait with a soft complaint. Then the door eased, and Elias came in as though entering water he knew well, hat in his hand, hair still damp, shoulders carrying fatigue like a familiar load. He glanced at the banked fire, at the towel folded on the hook, at her face, and stopped at a distance that gave her room yet still joined the circle of warmth. For a long, thin breath, she considered ending the night in silence, letting resentments cool into something brittle. But the truth she had learned would not permit such smallness, and the ache of not asking had already started to press against her ribs. She swallowed, felt the shake climb her throat and said, barely above a whisper that still filled the room,
Why didn't you tell me you own this place? The words looked too large once they existed, but they did not break anything. They simply stood there between them like a fence that needed crossing. Elias set his hat on the chair back and did nothing for several seconds, except breathe as if counting the boards in the floor, then answered with a voice that carried the steadiness of a wire drawn tight. He said he had learned, long before Windriver took his name on paper, that titles throw shadows over rooms where work should speak first, that men and women change their stance when a certain word walks in, and that he needed to see everyone as they are when rank holds its tongue, including a cook who had arrived with grit in her eyes and no cushion under her feet. He said he wanted the truth of people to show itself in tired hours, not in performances suited to a chair at the head of a table. He said he watched her catch the kitchen by its slipping edges and lift it level without demanding applause, and that nothing she had done owed a debt to anyone's grand introduction. Respect lives in seeing the real measure, he said, and you showed me yours before mine could distort it. Clara listened and felt two currents pull at once. One was anger, tidy and sharp, at being studied by a man who could tilt every decision with a word, a man who had let her walk blind past the desk where deeds slept. The other was recognition so clean it almost hurt, because what he described matched the lived map of her days. The small acts done when nobody clapped, the hands that move because something will break if they stop, the invisible hinge by which a place turned. She wanted to tell him that secrets cost, that she had spent years paying for other people's quiet machinations, that she had promised herself never again to be the last to know the shape of a roof over her head. She also wanted to admit that if he had walked in declaring command, she might never have seen the way he holds a room still without tightening it, the way a palm on cold iron can be gentler than any speech. Words collided at her lips, and what came out sounded smaller than the knot in. She said she felt examined. He accepted that and did not flinch. He said he had watched, yes, but not like a judge, more like a man guarding a dam in flood, making sure the stones held, checking for leaks, patching what he could reach. Her hands found the counter again. She looked past him at the doorway where the storm had once knocked rain across the threshold, and then back at the man who had stood in it, until others were safe. Her doubts lined up like deputies, each asking to be heard. Did he test everyone this way? Did the crew resent the mark? Was this about control or about making sure pride never rotted the timbers? He saw the questions forming and did not hurry her through them. He spoke about the first winter after taking over, when a foreman had used fear like a whip, and the ranch had almost cracked apart under that weight, and how he had learned to make authority a quiet beam that held a roof instead of a spike that pinned throats. He said the land rewarded steadiness and punished show, that cattle trust rhythm, that men and women do too, and that he had hoped she would find her footing without the distortion of obligation. You belong because you made it so, he said gently, not because I could have declared it. Heat rose behind her eyes. The past answered with sharp pictures. A clerk refusing credit while smirking at her threadbare sleeves. A landlord's nephew laughing on a stairwell when supper burned because the oven door would not hold. A neighbor weighing gossip like currents. Their shadows reached into this room and touched the new understanding that had startled her at noon. She felt watched, yes, but not in the peering way she had learned to evade. More as if someone had stood behind her with a hand under the heavy end of the board while she hammered nails, letting her think she lifted alone until the beam sat true. The difference mattered, yet trust never grows on a single night's talk. She said so. He nodded, and that nod felt like permission to keep her own measure. Silence followed, a careful one, not empty, pierced only by the soft breath of banked coals, and the dog's small dream noise. Elias reached for the kettle, tested the heat, poured water and set a mug where her hand could find it without moving from the brace of the counter. He did not close the distance that did not belong to him. He did not defend with boasts or gestures or apologies that would ask her to do lifting for his comfort. He let the space stand as if both of them had work to do inside it. She took the mug, grateful for warmth even as she resented needing anything at all, and asked what he had seen when he looked at her before a name was spoken. He said he saw a woman who made rooms stronger, simply by refusing to leave a weak joint unattended. A woman who set tools where people would reach without strain, who stretched beams with honor rather than shame, who gave storms less theater than they demanded,
who calmed quarrels by absorbing heat until only sense remained, who placed care where exhaustion tried to throw it away. He said he did not tell her, because he wanted that woman to keep doing those things for herself and for the place, not for his title. Her breath came easier and harder at once. She had felt invisible for so long that being named with such precision felt like standing under a clear sun, after weeks of iron sky, yet the bruise of concealment stayed. She set the mug down and asked if this would continue, this hiding in plain sight. He said the papers would be signed tomorrow in daylight with witnesses and practical talk, because deals need daylight, and that he would not pretend otherwise after that. He said the work would not change shape, though her understanding had, and that he hoped the new weight would not crush what had grown between the crew and its labor. She studied him, the set of his shoulders, the nick on his knuckle where rope had won a small argument, the way fatigue pulled at his mouth without souring it. The moment carried tension that did not cut. It stretched like good leather. She felt seen and unsettled, protected and measured, almost angry, almost relieved. She looked down at her hands and found the shake had lessened, not because a neat explanation had smoothed every edge, but because something truer than explanation stood before her, a man who had carried the ranch's weight by choosing service over display, and who now trusted her with the reason. The dog stirred and resettled. Outside, a faint breeze moved along the porch and left. She stepped away from the counter and turned the wick lower, sending the room into a gentler dark. She told him she would not promise more than she owned, that time would prove what words could not. He said time does that work better than any speech, then lifted the mop left to dry, set it properly in its corner, and checked the latch on the window that stuck when nights cooled. No flourish, only their eyes met again, and this time the silence between them felt less like a fence and more like a narrow bridge already holding. She gathered her ledger and the scrap where her rules lived, folded both and slid them into the drawer he had mended after the first storm. He tipped his head as if to say he understood that the conversation would resume when needed.
Morning settled softly across Windriver, and Clara worked with hands that knew every nick in the counter yet carried a new steadiness. Coffee breathed from the kettle, dough yielded under patient palms, and onions surrendered sweetness to the pan, while iron kept a faithful glow. The knowledge she held Elias's name inked to the land did not rearrange tasks, but it colored each small choice, lending weight to motions that once felt merely practical. She portioned batter so nothing was wasted, saved bacon drippings for gravy, and set aside biscuits wrapped in cloth for crews riding fence. Men came in with easy nods, voices warm from sleep and labor, and the simple rhythm of thanks sounded fuller than a week ago. Pike set a polished apple on the shelf without speaking. Mays checked the apron hook he'd driven and lifted it half an inch for her reach. The boy from the lower pens left a narrow jar of honey like a coin paid toward a debt no one asked him to owe. Respect had stopped being tentative. It had turned sturdy, a beam she could lean on when questions returned. Later she walked a line beside the north field, with a basket under her arm while Elias mended wire along a stretch that always gathered wind. He strung staples with unhurried precision, tested tension and crouched to clear a drift of old grass that might catch spark when summer dried everything hard. She stood close enough to pass nails and hold the post steady when the hammer met stubborn wood. Neither felt obliged to color silence with talk. Quiet simply kept them company. When a calf bawled near the draw, Elias paused, glanced over the slope, and waited until the sound slipped toward its mother, then finished the tie with a firm twist. He did not perform competently. He lived inside it, and that truth felt larger now that she understood the paper under the life. Back at the house she stirred a pot that began thin and turned hearty through patience, humility and cinnamon shaved from a stick she had saved for cold morning. The dog curled near her foot, warming one boot like an old agreement between companions. Through the window she watched Elias cross the yard, and her chest tightened in a new, not painful way, as if trust were a muscle pressed for the first time. He came in only to shift a bucket or check a latch, asked nothing dramatic, made room for her logic, and returned to whatever hinge needed him. If you carry a memory of discovering depth where you expected only surface, an aunt whose quiet paid your fee, a neighbor who showed up with a jack and calm words, a friend who listened through your worst hour, Allow that name to stand inside you now, because that is how understanding grew here, not through spectacle but through accumulation. Noons stretched wide and honest. Riders ate under a roof that no longer leaked, boots drying near the door, shirts steaming into light, chips of talk flickered, fences hay, a birth due in August, a colt learning manners, and laughter rose without showing its teeth. Clara took in every face and felt the way a room accepts a person once a place believes that person will keep it whole. Her past still visited, sharp as vinegar, a clerk's smirk, a door half closed, the hunger she had carried like a hidden stone. Yet those pictures met new ones that refused to bend, bowls refilled by hands she did not have to ask, shelves repaired before she noticed their slump, a lantern wick cut to the right length, a water barrel raised without making her feel small, work braided with regard, and together they made belonging, not as a favor granted, but as a structure built. Dusk found her on the porch snapping beans while Elias checked the hinge that loved to squeal when nights cooled. He loosened, oiled and tightened until the sound faded into the larger hush. She passed him a tin cup and he drank without commentary, eyes on a sky rinsed clean after long weather. Purple slid behind the ridge, gold pooled along the hayfield, and a hawk wrote a slow arc over cattle drifting toward water. They stood within that widening piece with nothing to solve. He set the cup down, said the south line would want riders at daybreak, and asked if the biscuits would travel well. She said they always did when wrapped warm. The exchange said everything and nothing. It held ease, care, and a question that neither felt a need to name. Night brought cards at the bunkhouse and a story that turned on a mule's refusal to cross a bridge. Someone tuned a harmonica, lost the tune, found a better one, and laughter came like rain after dusk. Clara carried a tray across the yard and set it down to a chorus of thanks that still surprised her, not because gratitude was new, but because it now sounded anchored rather than polite. She caught Elias's glance through the lamplight and felt the current she had tried to dismiss move again. He looked away first, not evasive, simply granting room in which a decision could grow at its own speed. Later, alone in the kitchen, she wrote her rules again, lines long worn smooth by repetition. Keep the fire steady, keep the food honest, keep your head up. A fourth appeared before she could judge it. Keep your gaze clear when respect arrives, disguised as quiet work. She folded the scrap into the ledger, so tomorrow's count would carry today's wisdom. In the following days, small scenes were stacked like plywood board. A colt tangled near a post. Elias spoke low until panic softened, then freed the rope with patient fingers. A heated argument began over branding order. He interrupted with one sentence that shifted attention toward the weather window they would squander if pride kept talking. Hank left a paper sack of dried peaches on the sill with a note for cobbler when the heat drops. Maze whittled a new spoon handle that fit her grip exactly. The boy from the lower pens repaired a screen so flies would meet a barrier instead of an invitation. Every gesture felt like a vote, and Clara counted them as carefully as she counted beans. She wondered about her own path under this widening sky. Did she want rooms beyond a kitchen built by grit and thrift? Did the ledger's numbers point toward someday owning something she could name aloud? Could affection grow here without becoming a debt? Elias's manner gave nothing away yet offered everything necessary. He asked which shelf height saved her shoulders, which pan balanced best on the left ring, and whether the path to the well needed a plank where spring mud lingered. He never asked for gratitude, never hinted at reward, never used position like a lever. That restraint pulled her toward him more surely than any declaration. The first truly clear sunset arrived like a benediction. Clouds thinned to lace, peaks held a last wash of rose, and the wind lost its argument with the cottonwoods. Clara stood with Elias by the corral, passing staples, listening to cattle settle into the slow breath of evening. He said the creek would fall by morning, and that the south gate could wait a day if she preferred a full market bake. She nodded and said pie crusts behave better when the air dry. He smiled with one corner of his mouth, as if delighted by knowledge carried in muscle memory, and returned to the wire with a rhythm that matched her cadence. Kneading dough, possibility walked near them, and kept its hands to itself. She felt stronger than she had in years, not because everything had been answered, but because questions now lived in a place that could hold them. Her future no longer looked like a road chosen for her by rooms that never learned her name. It looked like a valley that might say yes if she kept showing up with discipline, humor,
and a willingness to carry weight when the weather turned mean. When darkness pooled and the lamps bloomed, she returned to the stove with an easy heart and a sharpened. She tasted broth, corrected salt, slipped peach slices under a lattice glazed with honey, and placed the cobbler where heat could work its patient magic. Footfalls approached, voices softened at the threshold, and for the first time she felt that any door here would open for her without price. Beyond the window the Wyoming sky cleared to star-pricked velvet, promising a stretch of days shaped by work rather than calamity. She did not pretend to know where affection might go, nor whether the owner who wore plain boots would ever speak beyond useful. She only knew that silence had stopped feeling like a test, and started feeling like a language both of them understood. In that understanding she found comfort, not certainty, and a calm willingness to let time decide what neither wanted to force.
Clara stood on the porch at first light, while a golden tide climbed the blue edges of Wyoming and rinsed barns, fences, pasture, and creek in patient fire. Elias rode out with the crew, hats tipped against crisp air, silhouettes stretching long over dew-wet earth as hoofbeats stitched a steady drum along the yard and spilled onto the open range. She felt no pull from the towns that once weighed her. That earlier self stayed behind like a brittle shadow that finally chose another wall. The house breathed warm through the door she left ajar, coffee floating from the kettle, bread cooling on a rack, pans stacked clean after another sunrise start done without rush or apology. Windriver sounded awake in the way she now understood: a chain clink, a gate click, a laugh tossed toward a partner, a horse shaking off night. She touched the rail Elias had sanded smooth and saw where his palm had learned its curve, then lifted her gaze and found him near the front, guiding pace with a glance rather than a shout. Trust moved out with them, quiet as dust, lifting behind a steady cant. She stood straighter because belonging had settled in her bones like useful heat, not a borrowed coat draped only for show, but a weathered layer earned by work and attention. Where doubt once whispered, she carried a ledger of proof. Storms met, meals stretched without shame, arguments cooled by a single good sentence, a shelf mended before jars slid, a water barrel raised so hands could rest, a stove kept honest through long, wet blows. Elias turned his head as though he felt her watching, and even from that distance, she read the same calm she had learned to trust when weather tested everyone at once. Nothing in his posture asked for glory. Everything in his manner promised steadiness. The romance between them stayed unspoken, yet its current hummed through distance like a wire carrying power across fields, invisible until lamps bloom. She did not chase it or demand it. She let it gather room to breathe, the way bread needs space for rising. He carried the valley with a practiced ease that refused display, and that truth drew her more surely than any grand vow. Boots flashed, spurs blinked. Reins flicked arcs of light as the riders crested a hummock and flowed downslope toward the low field that always gathered strays. Behind her, the kitchen waited with lists and simple orders. She would finish the biscuits, wrap extra portions for the North team, check the bin, refill the lamp, and wipe the sill where dust likes to settle after the wind turns. Tasks no longer felt like penance. They felt like a language she finally spoke without an accent. The land had taught grammar: keep heat steady, measure salt with restraint, place buckets where spills cannot trick ankles, cut wick clean, let patience take first, watch when tempers lean toward spot. Through that grammar she had written a new sentence across her life, and it read plainly, I belong here. The riders reached the far gate. Elias lifted 2 fingers, groups split with practiced grace, and the herd, still drowsy, began to fold toward water. She remembered the girl who stepped down brittle with hunger, and remembered the woman who held iron during rain, while lightning made a mirror in every window. Both lived inside the cook, who now stood easy under a generous sky. Belonging had not arrived by invitation card. It arrived by repetition, 1,000 quiet choices that refused to quit. She traced that path with a thumb against the rail and smiled. Hoofbeats thinned as the crew fanned out, then rhythm returned. Farther away, folded into meadow sound. Light climbed the barns, found the patch Elias repaired after hail, and turned the repaired seam bright as a scar that no longer hurts. She breathed and felt strength rise like bread again. If you hold a memory of discovering depth where you expected surf, remember the first hint that changed your view. A neighbor steady under a broken axle,
A friend showing up past midnight without questions, an elder replacing criticism with a better tool, and let that recollection sit with you now as a quiet warmth. Stories like Clara's begin there, inside small recognitions that turn into anchors. Wind brushed her apron, a hawk lifted on a lazy current, cattle lowed beyond cottonwoods. The dog stretched, yawned, and padded to her heel with domestic certainty. She reached for the cup cooling by the jam, drank and accepted that answers about love rarely come stamped with guarantees. Questions lingered and did not trouble her. What future would this work build if the weather calmed for a season? Would she ever sign her own parcel, scribbling a name with fingers that no longer shook? Would that unspoken current ever cross the last narrow distance between cook and owner who refused to act like one? She did not need to force any moment. Time would swing its gate when both were ready. For now she carried a role that mattered to honest people, and a house that had learned her hands. She stepped down, crossed to the kitchen, and slid peach slices beneath a lattice, brushed it with honey saved by a boy who believed sweetness belongs on ordinary days. From the porch she watched the crew climb the far slope until their outlines floated against the sky. Elias's seat balanced, shoulders aligned with purpose, every motion frugal, like a line drawn with a sure pencil. Warmth spread through her chest, not drama, simply the clean burn of gratitude. The ranch had given her a rhythm sturdy enough to match breath. It had also given her a community that measured worth in labor, decency, and humor when things went wrong, not in gossip or borrowed shine. Hope, long allergic to rooms that used it carelessly, finally learned to She leaned the broom where it could dry, checked the latch and remembered to leave the door ajar for riders returning early. A raise struck the ledger on the table and lit the 3 rules she kept. She added a 4th line weeks back and touched it now. Keep your gaze clear when respect arrives, disguised as quiet work. The letters looked right under this sun. A bell rang from the barn, a playful clang made by hands not ready to start without mischief, and she laughed into her sleep. She was no longer the outsider. She was part of the place that would outlast storms and carry names forward after boots hang quiet. Her story, stitched from hard seasons, kindnesses and second chances, now had a porch, a view, and a reason to keep baking. If this journey touched you, stay with it. Subscribe today for more frontier tales driven by grit, heart, and clear-eyed hope. Share Clara's path on X, so friends who need stubborn light can find it. Invite them to join a community that believes strength grows in kitchens, corrals, and quiet rooms where people choose steadiness over spectacle. Tap follow, leave a comment about a moment when someone's hidden depth steadied your world, and help this campfire widen. Out here we honor resilience, reward honest kindness, and save empty noise for the wind. Another sunrise will set riders moving, ovens warming, and stories unfolding across hills. Be here when the next one breaks, and bring somebody who could use proof that second chances ride straight and true when hands choose to hold.